Well, good morning, everybody. Building on Stuart's rather more hopeful, positive presentation than some of the things we heard yesterday, I want to tell you another Cinderella story. So 20 years ago, I was in the number 10 policy unit and did energy policy, among various other things. And I tried to understand the potential for renewable energy. And the one which was the most obvious bastion of sandalwallahs and freaks was solar. Solar is fine at that point, and still maybe today, if it's on a buoy at sea or on a traffic light, or in a village without a grid connect, or on a satellite up in space. But at the sort of costs you were talking about, which in those days was $30 a watt or something like that, it was ridiculous to think about solar as a mainstream power source. Well, Cinderella is now going to the party. The good news is the Indians are very good at parties, so we're going to have one very big ball to let Cinderella come out, because solar is going mainstream. I don't know about the UK. I come, and obviously the sun does not shine here, but living in India, we do get a lot of sunshine, and this is a really good story going forward. So first of all, to introduce my company. This company, Kiran Energy, was set up 3 years ago when I left corporate life. I set it up with a partner, Adashir, who used to run KPMG India. So we're two professionals who've set up a new business, private equity backed. So we are US owned, which I'm not sure is good, bad or ugly, but means that we can get OPIC and Exim finance. And today we are India's leading solar company by contracted capacity. Not saying very much, we're at 75 megawatts contracted. We have 25 megawatts running. Two plants of 20 megawatts, which is the top plant in the picture, and 5 megawatts with trackers in the bottom picture there. So we're off to the race to try to get to the party as it develops. Now, India normally gets a bad press around climate, and possibly for very good reasons. Obviously, during the whole negotiation around Copenhagen and then Durban, the Indians were not entirely helpful towards getting a deal because they were protecting their own interest. If you're sitting in India, you cannot see why, just because the Europeans have burnt coal for 200 years and drive cars and have air conditioning units and everything else, why we can't also. So to suggest to a developing country that you cannot develop because of mistakes made by others is a somewhat inequitable and non-negotiable stance. That said, the government of India, I think, has come up with some extremely sensible policy responses to climate change. There is talk in India at the moment about policy paralysis, and the government is not doing much. But in the energy sector, in the solar sector, this is one of the good examples of sensible policy making. So, first point on the slide is at the moment our carbon per head is very low, as was described yesterday, just about 1.2 tons of carbon per head per year, which is a fraction of what we in the UK or American friends, or as you heard yesterday, people in Qatar might be putting out. The second point from this slide is that the big chunk of carbon in India comes from energy, from power, particularly obviously from coal, but from power for the grid. The third point obviously is that the economy is going to grow. So even at today's rate of 7%, which feels like a recession at 7%, I'm sure you feel sympathy for us growing at 7%, we still will need more energy every year. And the projection going out is that therefore our carbon footprint will grow, and from 2 tons per head, we might get up to something like 6, 7, 8 over the next 20 or 30 years, which is a significant contribution to the problem of carbon. So what can we do about that? Because the one thing that is non-negotiable is we cannot sacrifice growth. We need to grow and grow in a way which is responsible. Currently, energy is very heavily carbon, and particularly coal, dependent. So something like 65% of all the power in the country comes from coal. A growing part of that coal is imported, so there's an economic or foreign exchange issue with coal supply, a fuel security, energy security issue with coal supply. And clearly a lot more coal power plants will be built going forward. It remains the cheapest and most reliable and most versatile source of energy. But the good news is at the moment coal is only 65%, and if you include big hydro, renewables is getting on something like 30% of total energy. If you strip out big hydro, then renewables is only about 12% of total energy, but it is not a bad place to start. Looking forward, we obviously are going to have two things. One, growth, but two, if you look on the bottom right of this chart, we have an energy deficit. So if you live in rural Maharashtra, something like 25% of the time your power is off. If you're trying to educate your daughter, when she's doing her schoolwork at night, there is no power. So she's having to use a kerosene lantern or a candle. If you're trying to run a world-class business, you're probably doing it for 10–20% of the time using diesel gensets. So we have a world competitive IT industry running dirty fuel at 14 to 16 rupees, which is up to 25 cents a kilowatt hour of cost. So, turning to renewables. This chart shows the government's estimate, MNRE, the Ministry of Renewable Energy estimate of the total potential for each renewable class in the country. So you take two things away from this slide. The first is there is a lot of potential, which is unused. Wind, which is the largest renewable source at the moment, only about 1/3 of the wind sites have so far been taken. And there's the potential to do at least 50 gigawatts of wind across the country. Biomass, we've just been hearing from. Biomass is big already because people burn, obviously, wood, cow dung, and so on, but this is organised biomass. Only about 8% of potential is used. Small hydro, getting on 1/4, is used. But all of these alternative energies pale into insignificance compared to the potential of solar in India. We have sunshine. So at the moment, at a gigawatt installed across the country, we have only 1% of our potential source, sensible estimates of land use of solar. So in terms of Indian policy mix, the most important relative option for Indian renewables is solar. Last year, 7 gigawatts of additional generating capacity was added in the country. Half of it was renewable. Most of it was wind. So of the 7 gigawatts, 1 gigawatt was solar. So it is just beginning. That's really the first year one for solar in India. Just a couple of slides on the global solar market. And I know nothing about the UK, so please don't ask me to feed in tariffs here. I don't understand it. But globally, what's happening? Well, the good news is that this industry is basically, and I'm talking about PV, is basically a semiconductor industry in which Moore's law, or the learning curve, applies. And over the last 50 years in which PV has been around, there is a long-term learning curve of around 8% cost reduction every year. And that 8% cost reduction is basically coming from scale. It's scale, but it's also obviously innovation and it's efficiency. But basically all of those are driven by scale. So the wonderful thing the Germans did to the solar market is they kick-started, by the feed-in tariff regime 10 years ago, they kick-started a serious industry in solar. So it was no longer the bastion of sandal-wallers and cranks. It became a mainstream, sensible industry. And just last year, the solar industry doubled in terms of installed capacity. So we went to 64 gigawatts of installed capacity across the world, a doubling. And the year before that, it doubled. And this year again, it looks as if we'll increase by maybe 30%. And all of that was kick-started, as I said, by what happened in Europe. But now it is moving out of Europe. Because if you look in the bottom right of this slide, the little graph, if you can see it, the solar resource in the world is not in Europe. It makes little sense, relatively, to put solar panels up in Bavaria. it makes little sense to design your solar panels to take a load of snow and degrees, minus 30 in the Ukraine, because most of the capacity, the solar capacity across the world is obviously in the tropics. And the great potential markets for solar are the US, particularly the West and the South, southern Spain and North Africa, India, South Africa, which I didn't put a ring around, but it's a very interesting market, and parts of China. But at the moment, if you look at the top right of this graph, where the industry is Germany, and Spain, and the US. So actually, the solar industry at this point is misplaced in terms of relative competitive advantage. The great thing that the Germans have also given us, other than the scale of industry, is they've given us the Chinese. And it's very easy when you go to Delhi and Washington to be rude about the Chinese manufacturing contribution to world solar. They call it dumping. I call it fantastic. The Chinese have built 35 gigawatts of capacity. So why is cost coming down? It's partly demand, but it's also supply. The Chinese have built supply. I went recently to a plant of Trina Solar, which is a 2 gigawatt integrated plant from wafer all the way through to module, one site. And when my friends in India in the manufacturing industry complain about my buying Chinese, I ask them, well, if you are willing to scale up by a factor of 10 and integrate, not just modules, but go all the way back to silicon, then maybe you'll be competitive. But until you invest dollars in R&D, and you invest dollars in scale, and you provide a quality product at a competitive price, people will buy in China. And that's good news for all of us, in my view. And this is the result. So I told you that the historic trend is something like 8% a year. This is a graph from McKinsey, their report that's just come out, suggesting, looking forward, what's going to happen to cost. On the left-hand side of this is the cost of capital per watt peak. On the right-hand side, which matters more, is the conversion of that capital to the output of energy. So the energy coming out of this plant without any profit. And you can see broadly, today we are at 20 cents, US cents per kilowatt hour sold to customer. And it looks as if over the next 8 years, we're going to halve. And if we halve, we are going to get down to grid parity in just about every major market. Already solar is at grid parity in a number of markets like Japan, where energy is expensive. But over the next 10 years, we're going to get down to grid parity in almost every market in the world that has space and sunshine. And that is coming out of innovation, because the efficiency of panels every year is creeping up. It's coming out of productivity, it's coming out of scale, it's coming out of investment in balance of plant. It's not just the modules, it's also the inverters, the mounts and everything else that goes into a solar plant. So these are the underlying economics of the industry, and they are all positive. But as we heard, for a policymaker, it gives an issue because you do have a declining cost base. Okay, now we go on an Indian safari. India is a very good place for sunshine. If you think of India, you'll think it's quite hot. You might also think there's 1.2 billion people who are quite good at breeding, so there isn't a huge amount of land, but it's not so. There is a lot of surplus land. And the surplus land, the good news is, tends to be in the areas where it is hottest. So particularly up in the northwest, in Rajasthan, in the borders of Pakistan into Gujarat, places in Tamil Nadu, up in the mountains, there is available surplus wasteland not being farmed with very high insulation. And the insulation levels are something like twice Germany. So we are getting 320 days of sunshine in Rajasthan, so we have about a month of cloud during the monsoon, with high insulation levels. And if you look at the bottom right, that's a graph of total solar resource. So you can see India is as good as the US in terms of total potential solar resource, and twice as good as our friends in Germany, who are the market leaders at this point. Now, I'm not often nice about the Indian government, but here I'm going to be, because I think they have been very forward-looking. Here is our Prime Minister at Copenhagen announcing the 8 national missions around climate change, one of which is the so-called Jawaharlal Nehru, of course you have to call it after the great leader, Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission, but it is only one of 8. There's other things on energy efficiency and so on. But coming out of this initiative has come a very well thought through solar policy, taking on much learning and thinking from Europe, the experience good and bad in Germany, the experience good and very bad in Spain and Italy. They have come up with a policy that sets a target of 20 gigawatts in 10 years. That's the same, by the way, as the Chinese target. 20 gigawatts of solar by 2022, with milestones towards that. The next thing they said is that for anything from the central government, there will be a reverse bidding process. So one of the issues that you might have read about in India is that people accuse India of having corrupt practices. I can't imagine why anyone would say that. But this process of competitive bidding has been extremely open. And when the bids were open, it was a room like this in which envelopes were opened in front of everybody else, and each bid was placed up on the screen. So a very well-run and competitive process, bidding at a discount to the rate set by the central electricity regulator. The next innovative part of the policy was the central government said that one of the arms of the National Thermal Power Company would buy the power and then bundle it with 4 units of thermal power for every unit of solar and sell it back to the state-owned discoms. So the state-owned discoms are buying solar from the National Power Company, but buying it blended with other forms of power, so it becomes affordable in their eyes. Of course, it's a trick because the solar is expensive and the thermal is cheaper, and they would be buying the thermal anyway. But it looks better. We've now had 2 rounds of bidding under the national policy. Batch 1, which was for PV, was 150 megawatts, and there was 350 of CSP. And this batch 2, which is 350 megawatts of PV only. We, as Kiran, won a project in each of those 2 rounds. And if you look at the average cost of the tariff, central regulator had set 15 rupees, which is about 30 cents as the regulated tariff. The first round, the average was 12.16. And in the second round, that came down to, it says here 11.89, but actually it was much lower than that, it was about 8.89. So there's been significant reduction in the 12 months between the 2 rounds of bidding. So this has been a very successful policy in terms of developing a solar market in India, distributing projects fairly without inside track for those people well connected, and driving down the cost. So the lowest bid from a French company was 7 rupees 49 paisa, which is about 15 cents. And that is now the benchmark price for solar in India in the next few months, and I think it will come even lower. Now, the good news is we're not just dependent on central government. This is what's called a conjoint subject with the states, and therefore every one of the 28 states in India also has a renewable policy. And these are good, bad, and ugly. Easily the best solar policy is in Gujarat, where already the government has signed 959 megawatts of PPAs. It is a different process. In this state, the regulator sets the rate, and there is no bidding. It's an allocation based on anyone who is eligible for the 3 rounds that it now had. And so far, in the last 12 months, 600 megawatts, I think it's 604 as of today, have been commissioned successfully and are working, including one of our plants, our 20 megawatt plant is under the Gujarat policy. And other states such as Rajasthan, Karnataka, Orissa, Tamil Nadu, Andhra are in various stages of rolling out their own solar policies. The issue in many of those states is the state electricity boards are notoriously bankrupt. So in terms of selling them power, particularly power at a price which is higher than other forms of energy, it is a question mark as to whether you can bank a PPA signed with a state like Bihar or Uttarakhand or even Tamil Nadu, which is the worst loser in terms of the state electricity board. So you have the central government, you have the state governments, and then the third one, which in my view is the most important of all. Under the 2003 Electricity Act, the central regulator was given the responsibility, by the sound of it rather like the UK, of setting a total target for renewable power. And that target has been set at 15% of all power by 2020. And an obligation has been placed by the regulator on all users of electricity to buy a percentage of their power from renewable sources. At the moment, nationally it is 5%, and it will increase to 15% over the next decade. Within that, there is a specific obligation to buy solar. Otherwise, people would not buy solar because it's at the top end of the price range for now. So there is a separate so-called RPO, renewable purchase obligation, for solar power, which in most states, if you look at the graph, those are the percentage of solar power obligations at the moment, is something between 0.25% and 1% of total power. The way this is interpreted is for retail consumers, the obligation is not on them but on the DISCOM. So the distribution company stands in place for the retail customer and must buy up to 1% of its power from solar sources. But for large users, captive users and open access users, they have their own obligation. The obligation means you must either have your own solar power plant or buy solar power, or if you don't, you have two options. You can buy a renewable energy certificate in the market, or you pay a penalty. And the penalty at the moment is 14 rupees on top of what you would pay for the power. So there's a strong incentive to comply with the RPO obligation. This will drive power down to large industrial customers, which for me is the future, because large industrial companies are much more creditworthy and bankable than state electricity boards. So where are we today? Well, a gigawatt in a year. From a standing start, I think we had 12 megawatts commissioned in January 2011. We finished the year at about 820 megawatts in 2011. This year, we think that up to 3.5 gigawatts will be added in India of solar power. That's including the National Solar Mission, that's including the state policies and the RPOs. So the industry is going mainstream. Now, business in India is never boring, so we have lots of opportunity, but unfortunately, the normal Indian challenges. On the opportunity side, strong political support. It is about the only subject that the BJP and the Congress agree with. In fact, we've got Mr. Modi in Gujarat competing against the central government to come up with innovative, ambitious targets and rolling out solar. There is a shortage of energy. There is no shortage of demand. Obviously, there's a 10% deficit of power, so if we can generate and sell it, somebody will use it. We have sunshine, we have land, and our competition is creeping up. Issue with solar basically is cost, and the great news is thermal is getting more expensive. To build a thermal power plant in India with imported coal today, your output is going to cost at least 6 rupees. And if solar is being offered in 1 or 2 places at 7 rupees, the gap is now very small. But the challenges. Number one challenge, cost. We are still more expensive. So without regulation and subsidy, one of the two, people will not buy it. We're selling a commodity, which is an electron, and people don't want to pay more for an electron than they need to. But the cost is coming down. The second issue is our customers. The typical customers, the DISCOMs, are not in good financial health. So if we sign a long-term contract with them, 1, we're taking a risk, and 2, we may or may not be able to get that banked. So the customer issue and the poor financial health of the state electricity boards is a huge challenge for us. We've had issues with the banks, persuading them that solar in India works, and even though there's a 50-year history of PV around the world, somehow in Indian conditions this stuff is going to work. I think we're through that. As ever, there are land issues. We need large tracts of land, 5 acres a megawatt. So for our 20 megawatt plant using thin film, it's 150 acres. Our next plant is 50 megawatts. So we need 250 acres of land in one place. So, and we need to do that without causing problems with people who may be either owning the land or occupying the land illegally, and moving them off is not straightforward. We do need clearances and permitting, even though we have marginal impact on the environment. There are something like 35 clearances that we need to get, and as ever in India, getting a permission from the government is not straightforward, and particularly if you are a foreign-owned company, and we're covered both by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act, and we're two individuals who don't want to spend our lives fighting legal cases, so we will not do anything other than behave perfectly ethically. The grid is not very robust in many places, so we heard that solar is an intermittent resource, but more particularly the grid goes down. So if we are generating and the grid is not taking, we don't get paid. And then there are the normal thousands of implementation challenges, which I'm calling it euphemistically for the mess, which is trying to do anything on a large scale in India. Despite all those challenges, it is possible to do this, and 600 megawatts has come up in Gujarat, 900 megawatts across the rest of the country, and we will do 2.5 to 3.5 gigawatts this year. And this is why, really, this is the most important graph. This is for India, if you can see it, a forecast of cost versus competitive sources. So the two bars in the grey band at the top is the price and the cost of solar, forecast through to the end of the decade. And the red numbers at the bottom are the grid alternative, to the price at which the grid is used to buying power from alternative energy sources. And as you can see, two things. One, at the moment, there's still a gap. So our new plant coming up in Rajasthan is at 9 rupees 34 paisa, and Rajasthan is used to buying power at about 4 rupees. But in 2 or 3 years' time, we will be down to the same level. And I can offer a customer a 25-year contract, fixed price, no inflation. But if they buy from a thermal source, they have to make a calculation as to what's going to be the price of coal, what's going to be the rupee, whether Indonesia is going to introduce a export tax on coal. So I think we have a winning proposition on a strictly commercial basis with no subsidy in 2 or 3 years' time. And already I'm competitive against those gensets at 14 rupees. So looking forward, this is a very, very exciting opportunity for large grid-connected power plants like what we're doing at the moment. I think they'll get bigger. It won't just be PV. There are going to be alternative sources. CPV, we're very interested in, we're experimenting with, and CSP, which is concentrated solar thermal. At the moment, not the same risk-reward ratio as in PV, but we'll get there. The other thing about solar, it is entirely modular. You can do it on a rooftop, you can do it in a village, you can do it on a shop, you can do it in a factory. You can do it in the middle of a city, but you can also do it in a village where you don't have to wait for the grid to come to you. You can just install a mini grid or on an individual farmer's house. There are ways of being innovative around land use. So Gujarat, for example, has just put up 1 kilometre of canal with PV across the top of the canal. It has 2 benefits. It's land which is worthless for anybody else, but secondly, it reduces the evaporation from the canal. And they estimate that we can do at least 10 gigawatts on canals in Gujarat. Another suggestion that Mr. Modi made recently is the border of Pakistan is something like 3,500 kilometres. There is at least a 500-metre exclusion zone. Let's put solar thermal panels all the way along the border. So there are plenty of space if we think differently. And it's not just about pure energy. You can also use it in a hybrid form. So you can use it as a water heating source, either on its own or with other sources. You can put it into industrial input, anything that needs heat or steam, or cooling. And the wonderful thing about solar profile is obviously it has a profile in the middle of the day when the solar is generating and the sun is up. That's when you need your air conditioning. So using van machines, reverse osmosis machines, you can have solar cooling to take the load off your electrical chillers with a very positive economic payback. And then hybrid with biomass or with wind or with gas or anything else. So, a very positive outlook. If we're a gigawatt today, the government has set a target of 20 gigawatts by 2022. If we get down to grid parity, which everything suggests we're going to, then the world is much bigger than that. And one estimate would be, in 10 years' time, 60 gigawatts of solar in India. And 60 gigawatts selling not just to the state electricity boards, but also to corporates and individuals, houses and commercial establishments having solar on their roofs, either for own use or with a smart grid and smart metering going into the grid. "60 gigawatts would save 100 million tonnes of carbon. Now, that's only 5% of what India may then be generating in terms of carbon, but 5% is something. So if we're doing 10 or 20% of power and 5% of carbon saving, it's a contribution to both energy but also to the climate change issue. What do we need? Well, we need scale. We need open markets. So we do not need to exclude the Chinese. We need stable policies. So we need a roadmap that every year there is going to be a certain amount so that the industry can stay investing and stay developing and stay manufacturing. And we need finance. And I guess from the UK, the contribution to Indian solar is going to be finance, equity, debt, and mezzanine, quasi-equity. The City of London is meant to be the world's leading international financial centre. This is one market where I think the City of London should come and look to invest. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't want to risk losing too much time for Gil, but does anybody have any questions that they'd like to raise?
Not on UK solar policy. Oh, you put your hand down now.
No, I'm still there.
Yes. Could you say who you are?
Yes, Mike King, I'm the Chairman of Trustees of HRTP, and I apologise for being late this morning. Thank you. Alan, that is just so interesting and so encouraging. The only weakness that I can see at the moment with solar panels is that they are ugly and they are too big. Would you like to say a few words about what developments are taking place to try and reduce their size? I've just done it on my own garage roof, and I was told the other day that you can actually get roof tiles that are themselves solar panels. That seems to me to be a major step forward.
Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think they're beautiful. I love my plants. 150 acres of blue beauty. They're wonderful. But remember, my plants are places where nobody looks. So it's not NIMBY. It's in somebody's backyard where nobody ever goes. So there are new technologies. There are tiles that look like tiles, and there's building integrated systems which are being developed. So when I went back up to Cambridge recently and saw some technology which is, just normal glass, and you put the glass into the building and it will generate power. But these are in early stage development. They're not commercial. Building integrated systems are commercial, but not that sort of glass but you can't see it's actually generating. So obviously there are trade-offs. It needs space. It is visible if you put it up on a roof and on a house. There will be ways of mitigating, reducing that, increasing design. You can have these any colour you want. The blue is only there because it's the cheapest. You can have it black or green or red or anything else you want. And there will be different technologies which maybe will be less space dependent, and you can hide somewhere, dishes and other things.
My name is Roy Barry. I'm from PGS Energy. I've got one or two questions. A few years ago, when I used to go to Brussels quite regularly, they used to say that the energy used in producing solar panels will be significantly more than it ever produced in its life. And I don't know whether that's true or not.
It's not. The energy payback is about 1 year. And obviously if you're transporting, it's a little more, but basically it's 1 to 1.5 years of energy payback.
The second thing was, I think if you produce a third of your time electricity, perhaps 8 hours. How does the state or other counterbalance it when it really needs at night?
Yeah. Okay.
And the third question, if I may put it, the third one is, I think a lot of time in renewables, misleading just to say gigawatt. It should be gigawatt hour.
Correct.
Because you can have huge installed capacity, but you may not necessarily generate the figure that one implies.
Correct. No, I think you're right on a couple of those points. Not on the energy payback, which I think is wrong, but is often said by people who don't like solar. The two issues of solar at the moment. One is the cost, so we still need subsidy, or we need an application where there's no alternative. And the second is obviously we can only generate when the sun's shining. So until you get commercially acceptable storage technologies, we are not a solution to main grid, and we cannot be the only source of power. Now, with CSP, there are now storages, systems using molten salt and other things, which will take an 8-hour life and expand it to 16 hours of generation capacity, and people may eventually get to 24 hours. So with a CSP plant, we might go base load. And then the other thing you suggested there about efficiency. Yes, at the moment, most panels are still relatively low in efficiency. So you're talking of crystalline getting on for 20%, the rated capacity, and thin film, which increasingly is cost competitive, particularly in somewhere like India, because of the heat coefficient, is probably only about 12 to 13% efficient. So we need to push those efficiencies up towards their theoretical efficiency maximum, maybe 30%, to get greater energy yield and lower cost.
A friend of mine is a fellow Rosling, had to set up a mobile phone company in Nigeria. And to get coverage, you had to install 15,000 mobile phone masts. And because the energy supply in Nigeria is erratic, you had to have a backup diesel generator for each mast.
Correct.
And you therefore had to have fuel stored on site.
Correct.
Which meant you had to have 24-hour guards so they couldn't get stolen.
Yeah.
So he employs 45,000 people just to protect the fuel for the backup generator for his mobile phone masts.
Right.
Now it occurs to me that if he put in solar panels up a greasy pole so they couldn't be stolen, and then you compressed air embedded in the ground as a way of storing the energy, you'd have had a much cheaper solution.
Absolutely, that's already happening in India. It's not a market we do because we have a sister company, one of our investing companies that does this only. But the biggest off-grid application of solar is the 28,000 telecom masts across the country. And the numbers are, if you run your diesel set, just the marginal cost is 12 to 14 rupees. The cost of diesel to one of these telecom guys is 25 rupees because half is stolen. So even though you employ the guy to sit there, he's siphoning it off and sending it to his mates with the tractors.
Yeah, and occasionally they burn down the mast just to remind you they really need you.